Welcome, friend, to a quiet hour set aside from the rush of modern life. Tonight we're stepping back through time to March 1888, when the bustling heart of New York City fell silent beneath a storm that seemed to come from another world entirely. Let yourself settle in wherever you are. Dim the lights if you can. Let your breathing slow. There's nowhere you need to be but here, drifting alongside me into a winter that swallowed a city whole. Before we begin this gentle journey into the frozen stillness of 1888, I'll ask one small kindness. If you feel moved, press the like and hype button. It helps others find these quiet stories when they need them most. And leave a comment. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you watching in the deep silence of 3 a.m. or perhaps as morning light begins to touch your window? I'm always curious who walks beside me through these stories. Now then, adjust your pillow, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that gentle background hum. Let the present day fade like smoke and come with me to a time when telegraph wires hummed with urgent news, when trains rumbled on elevated tracks above cobblestone streets, and when a storm arrived that would stop it all, every wheel, every voice, every heartbeat of progress, beneath mountains of snow and ice. You live in the heart of New York City, though it bears little resemblance to the place you might imagine. This is 1888, and the skyline is low and jagged, built from smoke-stained brick and narrow windows that rattle in the wind. The streets are a cacophony of iron wheels on stone, the constant whinnying of horses, the sharp calls of vendors selling everything from coal to pickled herring. Above you, elevated trains clatter past on iron scaffolding, spewing steam and cinders onto the crowds below. Your home is a tenement room on the Lower East Side, one of hundreds stacked like boxes in a building that leans slightly to the left. The walls are thin enough that you hear your neighbors' arguments, their crying children, their coughing fits that go on through the night. The single window in your room is frosted over most mornings, ice crystallizing in delicate fern patterns on the inside of the glass. Beautiful? Yes, but a reminder of how little separates you from the cold that presses in from all sides. The iron stove in the corner is your universe during these winter months. It's a temperamental thing requiring constant attention. Coal must be added in just the right amounts, the flue adjusted, the ash pan emptied before it chokes out the flame entirely. When it burns well, you can stand perhaps 3 feet away and feel genuine warmth. Beyond that invisible circle, the cold reasserts itself with patient authority. Your breath hangs visible in the air, even indoors, even at midday. The coalman is supposed to come twice a week, his cart laden with black lumps that cost more than they should. But the streets have been difficult lately, frozen ruts and piles of soiled snow making passage unpredictable. Sometimes he comes late, sometimes not at all. On those days, you burn what you can find, scraps of wood begged from the carpenter down the street, newspapers saved and rolled tight, even the occasional piece of furniture too broken to serve any other purpose. The smell of burning newsprint has become a winter smell to you, acrid and oddly comforting in its familiarity. Each morning, you dress in layers that never quite seem enough. A cotton shift first, then a wool dress or work shirt, then a coat that has seen better years, its buttons replaced with mismatched substitutes, its hem bearing the salt stains of a dozen winters. Your boots are a particular source of anxiety. The leather has cracked along the toe, and no amount of dubbin seems to keep the water out anymore. Within minutes of stepping outside, you feel the cold seeping in, that specific ache that settles into your toes and refuses to leave until you've been back inside for an hour or more. Your work, perhaps in a printing shop, where your fingers grow black with ink, or maybe as a seamstress in a factory where the windows stay closed to keep the heat in and the air grows thick with lint and exhaustion, or possibly at the docks where men shout and cargo swings overhead in precarious arcs. Your work keeps you busy from early morning until the light begins to fail. Your hands never truly warm during these hours. They function, performing their tasks with the dull efficiency of long practice, but they ache with a deep, bone-level cold that has become simply a condition of existence from November through March. The winter has already been long. It's March now, and everyone speaks of spring with an almost desperate hope. The kind of hope that comes from months of grey skies and frozen streets, from waking in darkness and returning home in darkness, from the accumulated weight of cold that presses down on the spirit as surely as it numbs the flesh. Spring, when it comes, will mean soft air and longer evenings, streets that aren't treacherous with ice, the possibility of warmth without the constant tending of fire. But spring is not here yet. You wake one morning in mid-March, the 12th, though you won't remember the date until much later, when it's written in newspapers and spoken of in hushed tones, and something feels different. The quality of light is wrong. Too white, too thick. You rise and scrape at the frost on your window, peering out into a world that has turned strange overnight. Snow. But not the gentle snow of a typical winter morning, the kind that dusts the streets and makes everything briefly beautiful before the horses and carts churn it into brown slush. This is different. This falls in sheets, in waves, in curtains so thick you cannot see the building across the narrow street. The wind howls, not the usual winter wind, but something deeper, more ancient, as if the air itself has learned to scream. At first, you think perhaps it will pass. Storms do. You've seen heavy snow before. You wrap yourself in your coat and shawl and venture down the narrow stairs to the street level, thinking you'll head to work as usual. But when you push open the outer door, the wind tears it from your grip, slamming it against the wall with a crack that you feel in your chest. Snow swirls in, stinging your face like thrown sand, and the cold is of a different order than anything you've known. It doesn't just chill you. It assaults you, steals your breath, makes your eyes water instantly, tears freezing on your cheeks. You retreat inside, heart hammering. Others are emerging from their rooms, wrapped in whatever they own, faces pale and uncertain. Someone says the elevated trains have stopped running. Someone else says they saw a horse frozen mid-step in the street, buried up to its neck in drifts. The stories have that edge of unreality that comes with true disaster, when the normal rules seem to have been suspended. The day unfolds in a kind of slow-motion confusion. The storm does not relent. If anything, it intensifies. The wind finds every crack in the building's facade, whistling through gaps you never noticed before, carrying with it a fine powder of snow that accumulates in corners and along windowsills. The temperature inside begins to drop as the stove struggles against the cold, pressing in from all sides. You feed it carefully, rationing the coal you have left, wondering how long this will last, when the coalman might come again. The sounds of the city, the constant background noise that you've grown so accustomed to that you hardly notice it anymore, begin to disappear. The rattle of cartwheels fades, the shouts of vendors cease. Even the elevated trains whose schedule you could set your watch by have gone silent. What replaces these familiar sounds is something far more unsettling, the scream of wind, the periodic crack and crash, as something gives way under the weight of snow and ice, and beneath it all, a kind of deep, muffled silence that feels almost alive. You light a candle and place it near the window, more for the comfort of its tiny flame than for any practical purpose. Outside, the world has vanished. There is only white, white above, white below, white in every direction, swirling and shifting in patterns that mesmerize and disorient. You cannot tell where the street ends and the buildings begin. Distance has lost all meaning. Hours pass in a strange suspension of time. Normally, you would mark the day's progress by certain events: the arrival of the fish vendor at 10, the factory whistle at noon, the lamplighter beginning his rounds at dusk. But none of these things happen. Time becomes elastic, measured only by the slow burning down of candles, the periodic feeding of the stove, the growling of your stomach as you realize that the bread you bought yesterday is all you have, and you have no idea when you'll be able to buy more. Night falls, though you can hardly distinguish it from day. The world is equally white, equally opaque. You hear voices from other rooms, muffled conversations, a child crying, someone singing softly to themselves, or perhaps to others. The building settles and creaks under the weight of accumulating snow. You wonder about the roof, whether it will hold, but there's nothing to be done about it. You huddle closer to the stove, wrapped in your blanket, and try not to think about the coal supply dwindling, about the food running low, about how long a storm like this could possibly last. The wind continues its howling. It's a sound that gets inside your head, that makes rational thought difficult. It sounds angry, or perhaps hungry, as if the storm is a living thing seeking to devour whatever warmth remains in the world. You've heard old stories, fairy tales really, about winter spirits and ice demons, and on a night like this it's not hard to believe in such things. The darkness beyond your window seems full of malevolent presence. You try to sleep, but it's difficult. The cold has a way of keeping you just on the edge of wakefulness, never quite comfortable enough to fully let go. You drift in and out, dreaming of warmth, of summer days when the tenement room became stifling and you threw open the windows, of hot coffee in the morning, of the bakery 2 streets over where the ovens radiate heat you could feel from the sidewalk. These dreams have a cruel quality to them, offering comfort that evaporates the moment you stir and remember where you are. Morning comes again. The second day, though it hardly feels like morning, the storm has not diminished. If anything, the snow is deeper, the wind more ferocious. You hear that some people tried to venture out during the night, driven by various desperate needs, and have not returned. No one knows if they found shelter elsewhere or if they're buried in drifts waiting to be found when the snow eventually melts. The isolation begins to weigh on you. Your tenement is an island in a white sea, and there's no way to know what's happening beyond your immediate vicinity. The telegraph lines, you learn from a neighbor who knows about such things, have snapped under the weight of ice. The newspapers cannot print because the workers cannot reach the buildings. The postal system has ceased to function. The entire vast network of communication and connection that defines modern life has simply stopped, as if the city has been transported backward in time to some more primitive age. You ration your food carefully, a piece of bread in the morning, another in the evening. Some neighbors share what they have, a bit of dried meat here, some preserves there. Others hoard their supplies, and you can hardly blame them. No one knows how long this will last. The coal supply is a particular worry. Already, you can feel the stove burning less hot, the circle of warmth around it shrinking. You wear your coat indoors now, and your blanket, and still you shiver. The third day brings no relief. The storm batters the city with unrelenting fury. You hear stories filtering through the building. Someone's grandfather has died of the cold on the top floor. A pregnant woman has gone into labor 2 streets over with no way to fetch a doctor. A group of men tried to dig a path to the nearest market and gave up after an hour, having made no measurable progress against the constantly refreshing snow. Your world has contracted to these few rooms, these few faces. The neighbors you barely spoke to before have become your entire society. You share news, rumors, speculation. Someone says they heard that the mayor is trapped in his mansion uptown. Someone else insists that the elevated train lines have collapsed under the weight of ice. A child asks if the snow will ever stop, and no adult can offer a convincing answer. The monotony of being trapped is its own special torment. You cannot work, cannot shop, cannot walk, cannot do any of the normal things that structure your days. Instead, you sit and wait, feeding the dwindling coal supply to the stove in smaller and smaller amounts, trying to make it last, wrapping yourself tighter in blankets that smell of old smoke and unwashed wool. Your muscles ache from inactivity and from the constant tension of shivering. Your mind grows foggy with hunger and cold and the strange timelessness of captivity. You find yourself thinking about history, about other disasters. You've heard stories of great fires, of ships sinking, of wars and plagues. But there's something uniquely eerie about this. A storm is not an enemy you can fight. It's not a problem you can solve with cleverness or courage. It simply is, and you must endure it and hope that it ends before you do. Sometimes you stand at your window, scraping clear a small circle in the frost and stare out into the whirling white. There's a hypnotic quality to it, the way the snow moves, never still, never the same. Patterns emerge and dissolve. Sometimes you think you see shapes in the storm, figures moving, dark forms passing through the white. But when you blink and look again, there's nothing. Just the endless dance of snow and wind and cold. The fourth day, and the storm begins to show signs of weakening. The wind, while still fierce, has moments of relative quiet. The snow, while still falling, does so less intensely. These small changes feel monumental. Hope, which had been carefully suppressed, begins to stir again. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. Perhaps soon the city will wake from its frozen sleep. But for now you continue to wait. You sit by the stove, which has burned down to embers because the coal is nearly gone, and you pull your blanket tighter, and you think about warmth. Not the desperate, urgent need for warmth, but warmth as a memory and a promise. The warmth of spring sun on your face. The warmth of a full belly. The warmth of being safe and certain and unafraid. Outside, the city lies buried. Somewhere out there, under the snow, are the streets you walked, the buildings you knew, the life you lived before the storm came. It's all still there, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to resume. But in this moment, it might as well be 1,000 years ago, a lost civilization, something that exists only in memory and hope. The rhythm of your days has become elemental. Cold, hunger, waiting. Nothing more complicated than survival, nothing more ambitious than making it through to the next day. In a strange way, there's a clarity to it. The usual worries, money, work, reputation, future plans have faded into irrelevance. There is only now, only this, only the immediate and urgent need to stay warm enough, fed enough, alive enough. You wonder what you'll remember of this later, when it's over. Will you remember the fear, the hunger, the specific ache of cold that settles deep in your bones? Or will you remember something else, the way neighbors who never spoke before shared their last bit of bread, the sound of someone singing in the darkness, the stubborn resilience of a candle flame refusing to go out? Night falls again, the fourth night, and the storm is definitely weakening now. You can sense it in the quality of the wind, in the way the snow falls more vertically and less horizontally. Tomorrow perhaps, or the day after, you'll be able to open the door. You'll step out into a transformed world, streets buried and unrecognizable, and you'll join others in the slow work of digging out, of checking on neighbors, of accounting for who made it through and who didn't. But for tonight, you're still trapped, still waiting, still suspended in this strange pocket outside of normal time. You close your eyes and listen to the wind, which sounds almost tired now, like a beast that's run itself to exhaustion. And you think about spring, which surely cannot be far off now, which must come soon, which will arrive like a promise kept, bringing with it the warmth you've dreamed of through these long, frozen days. Let us drift now from the crowded tenements and narrow streets to follow a single man through the storm, a man whose name once carried weight in the highest chambers of power, whose decisions shaped the course of a nation, and who would meet his end not in the halls of Congress, but in the white chaos of a March blizzard. Roscoe Conkling was born into a world of privilege and expectation. His father was a congressman, a judge, a man of letters and influence, and young Roscoe inherited not just wealth, but a certain bearing, a way of moving through the world as if it owed him deference. And for much of his life, it did. By the time he reached manhood, Conkling had developed a reputation. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a powerful build that he maintained through careful exercise and discipline. His hair, which he wore in an elaborate curled style that became something of a trademark, was auburn and dramatic. His manner of dress was impeccable, almost foppish by the standards of the time, with perfectly tailored suits and a collection of colorful vests that made him instantly recognizable. But beneath the peacock exterior was a mind sharp as winter ice and a will that bent toward domination. He entered politics young, becoming a congressman from New York at 29, and he took to it with the fervor of a man who had found his calling. His specialty was not gentle persuasion or diplomatic compromise, but rather a kind of brilliant, brutal directness. He made enemies easily and seemed to enjoy it. His speeches were famous for their eloquence and their cruelty. He could eviscerate an opponent with language that left audiences gasping and laughing in equal measure. There was the time he destroyed James G. Blaine on the House floor, responding to some perceived slight with a speech so savage that it was remembered for decades afterward. He called Blaine's rhetoric a turkey gobbler strut, mocked his grandiloquent swell, and suggested that his opponent's ambition far exceeded his capacity. The insult sparked a feud that would last their entire lives, a bitter personal hatred that transcended mere political disagreement. But Conkling was more than just a talented insulter. He understood power in its purest form, how to acquire it, how to wield it, how to make men bend to his will, not through inspiration, but through fear and favor. When he became a senator from New York in 1867, he set about building a political machine that would make him one of the most powerful men in America. His method was the spoils system, that old and much criticized practice of rewarding political loyalty with government jobs. Conkling perfected it, turning the New York Customs House into his personal fiefdom, controlling thousands of appointments, generating loyalty through patronage, building a network of men who owed their livelihoods to his favor. Presidents negotiated with him, cabinet members deferred to him. For a time in the 1870s and early 1880s, Roscoe Conkling was arguably more powerful than anyone in Washington except perhaps the president himself, and even that was debatable. He had his moment of greatest influence during the disputed election of 1876, when he helped navigate the complex and dangerous political crisis that threatened to tear the country apart again just 11 years after the Civil War ended. He was a kingmaker, a force to be reckoned with, a man whom other men watched carefully and crossed at their peril. But power of this kind is always precarious, always dependent on maintaining the complex web of relationships and favors that sustain it. And Conkling, for all his brilliance, had a fatal flaw. He could not bend, he could not compromise, he could not forgive slights or work with enemies, or do any of the small, necessary humiliations that political survival sometimes requires. His downfall came in 1881 when the new president, James Garfield, defied him over an appointment to the New York Customs House. It should have been a minor dispute, the kind of thing that politicians navigate with some backroom dealing and face-saving compromise. But Conkling turned it into a test of wills, a grand dramatic gesture. He resigned from the Senate in protest, expecting to be triumphantly re-elected by the New York legislature as a vindication of his power. The vindication never came. The legislature, tired of his high-handed methods and seeing an opportunity to free themselves from his dominance, refused to re-elect him. After months of bitter fighting, Conkling was forced to accept defeat. At 51 years old, at the height of his powers, his political career ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, rejected by the very state he had controlled for so long. He retreated into private life, returning to New York City to practice law. It was a comfortable retirement in material terms. He earned handsomely from his legal practice, maintained his elegant lifestyle, moved in the highest circles of New York society. But something had gone out of him. The fire that had driven him through decades of political combat had dimmed. He was still Roscoe Conkling, still recognized and respected, but he was yesterday's man, a figure from a rapidly receding past. By March of 1888, 7 years after his resignation, he had settled into a routine. He maintained offices in the financial district near Wall Street, where he advised corporate clients on matters of law and politics. He lived in a comfortable apartment uptown. He walked between the two daily, maintaining the physical discipline that had always been part of his self-image. At 58, he was still imposing, still carried himself with that same erect bearing, that sense of command, even if the sphere of his command had shrunk to a manageable corner of Manhattan. On March 12th, he was in his office when the snow began. At first, it was merely an inconvenience, the kind of late-season storm that sometimes sweeps through the northeast, dumping a foot or so of snow before moving on. His colleagues suggested he stay, wait it out, perhaps spend the night at a hotel nearby. But Conkling dismissed the idea. He would walk home as he always did. A little snow was not going to alter his routine. By mid-afternoon, when he finally stepped outside, the storm had transformed into something else entirely. The snow was not falling so much as flying horizontally, driven by winds that roared through the narrow streets like water through a canyon. The temperature had plummeted. The few people still outside moved like ghosts, bent double against the wind, their progress measured in feet rather than blocks. Conkling pulled his coat tight, a fine wool coat, well made, but designed for normal winter weather, not for this, and began walking north. He knew these streets intimately, had walked them thousands of times, but within minutes they became unrecognizable. The snow was already several feet deep, drifting higher in places, and every step was an effort, his feet sinking and struggling for purchase. The wind tore at him, seeking every gap in his clothing, stealing his breath, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He pressed on. This was, in its way, the same quality that had made him a formidable politician, an absolute refusal to yield, an iron will that did not bend to circumstances. He had faced down presidents and party bosses, had stared down mobs and opponents, and he was not about to be defeated by weather. But the storm was not a political opponent. It did not care about his reputation or his will or his dignity. It simply was implacable and indifferent, and with every step he took it pressed harder against him. Other people had given up, had sought shelter in doorways or shops or whatever refuge they could find. The streets were nearly empty. Those few who saw Conkling later described him as a dark figure moving through the white, his distinctive hair plastered to his skull, his face red and then white with cold, but his posture still somehow erect, still maintaining that bearing even as the world dissolved around him. He made it a few blocks, then a few more. Union Square was ahead, a landmark he knew well, and beyond that not so far to home, but each block took longer than the last. His legs, strong from years of daily walks, began to falter. The snow was above his knees now, each step requiring him to lift his foot high and plunge it down again. And the wind was relentless, pushing against him like a physical force, making forward progress almost impossible. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His face had lost feeling. Ice formed on his moustache and eyebrows. He could feel his body beginning to fail in small ways. A stumble here, a moment of dizziness there, his thoughts becoming sluggish and confused. Somewhere near Madison Square, after hours of walking a distance that should have taken perhaps 30 minutes, Roscoe Conkling fell. He pulled himself up, took a few more steps, and fell again. This time, rising was harder. His limbs would not quite obey him. The cold had penetrated deep, shutting down the extremities, the body's desperate attempt to preserve the core. Passers-by found him there, this once powerful man collapsed in a snowdrift, semi-conscious, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. They dragged him into a building, wrapped him in whatever they could find, tried to warm him. He was conscious enough to tell them his name, to give them his address. His mind, that sharp instrument that had sliced through so many political tangles, was still working, but his body had betrayed him. They got him home eventually, after the storm had passed enough to make travel barely possible. A doctor was summoned, and the diagnosis was grim. Severe frostbite, particularly to his feet and hands. The tissue had frozen and begun to die. There was nothing to be done but wait and see how far the damage extended. Conkling lay in his apartment, attended by doctors and friends, as the frostbite ran its course. The pain, when sensation returned, was apparently excruciating. The affected areas turned black as the tissue necrotized. Gangrene set in, that ancient killer, and began to spread. They considered amputation, but he was already weakened, his heart strained by the ordeal, and the surgery might kill him as surely as the infection. He lingered for weeks, growing weaker day by day. The newspapers followed his decline with morbid fascination. Roscoe Conkling, brought down not by political enemies, but by a snowstorm, dying by inches in his uptown apartment, while the city thawed and resumed its normal rhythms outside his window. He died on April 18, 1888, just over a month after his walk through the blizzard. The official cause was complications from pneumonia and heart failure, but everyone knew the real cause. The storm had killed him, as surely as if it had buried him in a drift and left him there. His funeral was large and solemn, attended by politicians and businessmen and society figures. The eulogies spoke of his contributions to the Republican Party, his service to the nation, his brilliant mind and powerful personality. But there was also inevitably discussion of his manner of death and what it meant. Some saw in it a kind of Greek tragedy, the proud man brought low by his own inflexibility, his refusal to bend to circumstances, to accept help, to acknowledge that perhaps this once retreat might have been wiser than persistence. The same quality that had made him a formidable politician had killed him in the storm. He would not yield, could not yield, and so he died. Others saw it differently, as a kind of nobility, a man who maintained his dignity and his routine even in the face of catastrophe, who died as he had lived, on his own terms, refusing to be dictated to by circumstances. There was something admirable, they argued, in that stubborn march through the snow, even if it had ended badly. But perhaps the truest interpretation is the simplest. Roscoe Conkling was a man of his time, shaped by the 19th century's faith in will and discipline and the dominance of civilized man over nature. He had spent his life imposing his will on others, shaping events to his design, refusing to accept defeat. And when he faced the blizzard, he approached it the same way, as something to be overcome through force of character. The blizzard did not care about his character. It was indifferent to his history, his accomplishments, his reputation. It was simply cold and wind and snow, operating according to laws more fundamental than politics, more ancient than civilization. And in that contest between human will and natural force, nature won, as it always does eventually. His death became symbolic of the storm itself. The way it cut across all human distinctions, rendered meaningless all the hierarchies and structures that seemed so important in normal times. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all froze the same, all struggled the same, all were equally small beneath the vast indifference of the storm. In the weeks after his death, as the city slowly recovered and tallied its losses, Conkling's story was told and retold. It became a parable, a cautionary tale, a piece of folklore, the mighty senator defeated by snow, the man who would not bend, broken by wind. It carried a lesson that people recognized instinctively, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. That there are forces in the world larger than any individual human will, and that wisdom sometimes lies in knowing when to yield. But there was also something poignant about it, something that touched people. Here was a man who had lived a large life, who had been at the center of great events, who had known power and influence and the heady thrill of shaping history. And in the end, he died as so many others died that week, cold and in pain, felled by the same storm that killed anonymous workers and street children and all the others whose names were never recorded. In death, Roscoe Conkling became more than he had been in life. He became a symbol, a story, a ghost that would haunt the memory of the great blizzard of 1888, and perhaps in some strange way that was a more lasting legacy than anything he had achieved in politics. His laws and appointments and political maneuvers faded into history, studied by scholars but forgotten by the general public. But the story of his walk through the snow lived on, passed down through generations, still told more than a century later. The man who had craved power and recognition, who had fought so hard to be remembered, who had shaped his entire life around the pursuit of lasting influence, achieved immortality through an act of stubborn foolishness, through a fatal walk in the snow. History has a sense of irony that even the cleverest politician cannot anticipate. Let us drift now into stranger territory, into the spaces between recorded fact and remembered feeling, where the great blizzard of 1888 left traces that cannot quite be catalogued or explained. In the years and decades that followed, the storm took on a life beyond mere meteorological event. It became myth, memory, and something else, something that lingered in the bones of the city like an old ache that returns on cold nights. The transformation was not immediate. At first, in the weeks and months after the snow finally melted, people spoke of the storm in practical terms. They discussed the damage to property, the disruption to commerce, the heroic efforts of those who had kept essential services running. They tallied the costs in dollars and lives, made plans for recovery, began the work of rebuilding. But beneath this practical discourse, something else was happening, a slower and more subtle process by which the storm was being absorbed into the city's consciousness in ways that transcended mere historical record. There were the letters, found years later in attics and estate sales, tucked into forgotten books or folded carefully in drawers that no one had opened in decades. Personal accounts written during those days of captivity when the world outside had turned to howling white, and the future was uncertain. These letters had a quality to them, a particular tone that historians would later remark upon, a sense of speaking from outside normal time, as if the writers had been transported to some other realm where the usual rules no longer applied. They wrote with an intensity that suggested they believed these might be their final words, their last chance to communicate something essential to those they loved. The handwriting itself often betrayed this urgency, sometimes rushed and careless, other times painstakingly careful, as if the act of forming each letter was a kind of meditation or prayer. The paper they wrote on varied wildly. Some had proper stationery, others tore pages from books or used the backs of bills and receipts, whatever was at hand, when the need to document became overwhelming. A woman in Brooklyn, whose name was lost but whose words survived, kept a diary through the storm. Her entries for March 11 were mundane: the price of butter, a disagreement with her sister, plans for spring cleaning. The weather had been noted as unsettled, but nothing more. She had concerns about a cough her youngest child had developed, wondered whether the medicine she'd purchased would be sufficient. She wrote about her neighbor's new hat, which she found ostentatious, and about her hope that spring would arrive early that year. On March 12th, her handwriting changed, became smaller, more cramped, as if she were rationing the space on the page. The transformation was striking. The confident, flowing script of the previous day had given way to something more controlled, more anxious. She described the wind as having a voice, as speaking in low tones that she could almost understand, but not quite. It reminded her, she wrote, of her grandfather's stories about the old country, about winters that could kill and winds that carried warnings. She had always thought those stories were exaggerations, the kind of embellishment that old people used to make their youth seem more dramatic. Now she was not so sure. She wrote about the strange quality of the light, or rather the absence of light, even during what should have been daytime hours. The windows had become opaque with snow and ice, transforming them from portals to the outside world into blank walls of white. She described feeling entombed, buried alive in what had been her home just hours before. The familiar rooms took on an unfamiliar character in this twilight state, shadows gathering in corners that had never seemed dark before. On March 13, her entries became more fragmented, less coherent. She wrote about seeing her husband's face in the frost patterns on the window, about hearing her mother's voice in the howling wind, though her mother had been dead for 5 years. She described the cold as something alive, something with intention that was actively seeking ways into the house. They had blocked the gaps around the doors with rags and towels, but still the cold found its way in, creeping along the floor like something sentient and malevolent. On March 14th, her final entry read simply, "Still waiting for morning." The next pages were blank. Her body was found 3 weeks later when the house was finally opened, seated at her writing desk, pen still in hand, frozen in the act of reaching for words that never came. The diary was preserved by a distant relative who discovered it among her effects, and it eventually made its way to a historical society where it remains to this day a testament to those final hours. In a telegraph office in Lower Manhattan, a group of young operators found themselves trapped when the storm hit. These were men who made their living through the transmission of language, who spent their days translating human thought into electrical pulses that traveled at the speed of light along copper wires. They were, in a sense, the cutting edge of modern communication, part of a network that had shrunk the world and made distance almost irrelevant. But now the wires were down, snapped under the weight of ice, and they were cut off from the network that defined their professional existence. The irony was not lost on them. They, who spent their days connecting people across vast distances, were now as isolated as if they had been stranded on a desert island. The telegraph keys sat silent on their desks, useless without the wires that gave them meaning. One of them later wrote about the strange disorientation of this silence, how the absence of the familiar clicking and tapping created a void that seemed to expand with each passing hour. They were accustomed to constant communication, to the flow of information from around the country and the world. Now there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of the building as it strained against the storm. They burned the furniture to stay warm, chairs first, then desks, finally even some of the wooden parts of the telegraph equipment itself. Each piece of furniture fed to the makeshift stove represented a small defeat, an acknowledgement that this was not going to end quickly. The chairs were easiest to sacrifice, merely functional objects with no particular sentimental value. The desks were harder, each one a personal workspace, marked with the scratches and stains of daily use, familiar and somehow comforting in their shabbiness. Breaking them apart required both physical effort and a kind of psychological surrender. The walls of the office were lined with cork for sound insulation, and someone discovered that cork, while not ideal, would also burn if you were desperate enough. It produced an acrid smoke that made them cough and burned their eyes, but it generated heat, and heat was survival. They tore the cork from the walls in sections, revealing the bare wood and brick beneath, transforming their workplace into something that looked ransacked and abandoned. The professional dignity of the space dissolved piece by piece as they fed it to the fire. In the smoke and darkness, by the light of improvised torches, one of them carved a message into a wooden beam. "The fire talks when we do not." It was a cryptic statement, one that perhaps made more sense in the context of their particular profession and predicament. Without their telegraphs, without the ability to send and receive messages, they were reduced to a more primitive form of communication, the fire itself becoming a kind of language, its crackling and hissing filling the silence that the telegraph keys had left behind. It was discovered during a renovation in 1923, and the beam was preserved, put on display in a museum, though few visitors understood what it meant or why it seemed to carry such weight. The official death toll from the blizzard was recorded as approximately 400 people, though even at the time, officials acknowledged this was likely an undercount. The actual number would never be known with certainty. The city's record-keeping systems, still somewhat rudimentary in 1888, were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Deaths were reported when bodies were found and identified, but the chaos of the storm and its aftermath meant that many were never properly accounted for. Bodies were found for weeks afterward, some in expected places, doorways, alleys, abandoned carts, and some in locations that made no sense at all. Each discovery added to the growing sense that the storm had scrambled not just the city's infrastructure, but reality itself. The spatial logic of the city seemed to have been suspended during those 3 days. People were found far from any logical path they might have taken, in places they had no reason to be. A man in a top hat and evening dress was found in a tree in Central Park, frozen in a sitting position among the branches, as if he had climbed up there seeking perspective and simply stayed. The position of his body suggested calm rather than panic, a deliberate choice to ascend rather than an accident of the storm. His hands were clasped in his lap, his face turned toward the east, eyes closed. No identification was found on his person, and despite inquiries, no one ever came forward to claim him. He was buried in an unmarked grave, one of dozens from the storm whose identities were never established. A child was discovered in a church basement, tucked behind the boiler, wrapped in altar cloths. The discovery was made by the church sexton more than a week after the storm, drawn by an instinct he could not explain to check a space that should have been empty. The child could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, though it was difficult to tell with certainty. The altar cloths that wrapped her were of fine quality, embroidered with gold thread, the kind reserved for high holy days. How she had come to have them, why she had chosen or been placed in that particular spot, remained mysteries that were never solved. But beyond the bodies that were found, there were the absences, people who were last seen during the storm and never seen again. These disappearances were perhaps even more troubling than the confirmed deaths, leaving families in a state of perpetual uncertainty, unable to grieve properly because they could not be certain their loved ones were truly gone. Wives who went looking for husbands, children sent on errands who never returned, workers who left their jobs to try to reach home and vanish somewhere in between. The city in that era was not yet equipped with the identification systems and record-keeping that would make such disappearances traceable. There were no universal identification cards, no centralized databases of residents, no systematic way to track people across the urban landscape. People existed in networks of personal recognition, known to their neighbors and family, but not to any larger system. When those people vanished into the snow, they left gaps that were felt but not officially recorded. In the immigrant neighborhoods, where language barriers and suspicion of authority made official counts even less reliable, the number of missing was whispered about, but never confirmed. These were communities that had learned to be wary of official inquiries, where census takers were often met with evasion, and where the idea of reporting someone missing to the authorities carried its own risks. People might be in the country illegally or under assumed names, or trying to escape obligations or enemies from the old country. The storm's chaos provided cover for many kinds of disappearance, voluntary and otherwise. Entire families, some said, had frozen in their tenements, their bodies not discovered until summer, when the smell finally attracted attention. The tenements of that era were overcrowded fire traps even in the best of times, with inadequate heating and poor ventilation. During the storm, when coal supplies ran out and temperatures plummeted, they became death traps. Some buildings were so poorly constructed that the wind found every crack and crevice, making it nearly impossible to maintain any warmth at all. The very architecture of poverty contributed to the death toll in ways that were understood but seldom acknowledged in official reports. Others insisted that some of the missing had simply used the storm as an opportunity to disappear, to shed old identities and obligations, to vanish into the chaos and emerge somewhere else as someone new. It was not an entirely implausible theory. The storm created a moment of profound disruption when normal social surveillance broke down and people could move about unseen. A man could walk into a snowstorm and, if he survived, arrive somewhere else claiming to be anyone. The storm erased tracks, both literal and metaphorical, and in a city where many were trying to escape something, debt, family troubles, legal problems, unhappy marriages, it presented a unique opportunity. The storm itself became a subject of scientific fascination, though the meteorology of the time was poorly equipped to fully explain it. The weather prediction capabilities of the 1880s were rudimentary at best, relying on scattered observation points and limited understanding of atmospheric dynamics. Barometers and thermometers could measure local conditions, but the larger patterns that governed weather systems were still poorly understood. The telegraph network had made it possible to share observations across distances quickly, allowing meteorologists to track storms as they developed, but the interpretation of this data remained more art than science. The United States Signal Service, which handled weather forecasting in that era, had failed to predict the blizzard's severity. They had noted a low-pressure system developing, but had not anticipated how it would interact with other atmospheric conditions to create the monster that eventually struck. In their defense, the storm was something of an anomaly, a confluence of factors that occurred rarely enough that there was little precedent to guide predictions. But the failure still stung, both professionally and personally. The forecasters had to live with the knowledge that a better warning might have saved lives. In the aftermath, meteorologists pored over the data, trying to understand what had happened. Weather maps were reconstructed showing the position of air masses and pressure systems in the days leading up to the storm. Temperatures and wind readings from across the eastern seaboard were compiled and analyzed. Patterns began to emerge, revealing the complex interaction of systems that had produced the blizzard. What they discovered was a collision of air masses so perfectly balanced in their opposition that it had created something like a meteorological war with the eastern seaboard as the battlefield. Cold Arctic air plunging south met warm Gulf air pushing north, and where they met, the temperature gradients were so steep that they generated winds of extraordinary violence. The boundary between these air masses became a zone of intense instability, where the atmosphere was literally torn between two opposing forces. The rotation of the Earth added its own influence, creating a cyclonic motion that pulled moisture from the Atlantic and wrung it out as precipitation. The moisture from the Atlantic caught in this conflict was wrung out as snow, not the gentle accumulation of a normal snowstorm, but something more like a waterfall of ice crystals accumulating at rates of several inches per hour for days on end. But the dry scientific explanation somehow failed to capture what people remembered about the storm. There was something in the experience that exceeded meteorology, something that felt almost intentional. The numbers and diagrams could describe what had happened, but not what it had felt like, not the visceral terror or the strange alterations in perception that many reported. Science could tell you that the temperature had dropped to a certain degree, and the wind had reached a certain speed, but it could not convey the experience of being inside that cold and that wind, of feeling your body shut down and your thoughts become sluggish and your awareness narrow to the single, desperate need for warmth. The wind didn't just blow, it hunted, seeking out every crack and crevice. This was how survivors described it again and again, using language that suggested agency and intelligence. The wind found weaknesses in buildings, exploited gaps in clothing, targeted the exposed skin of face and hands with what felt like deliberate cruelty. It changed direction constantly, making it impossible to shield yourself effectively. Turn away from it, and it would come at you from another angle. It was relentless and tireless, never pausing, never offering a moment of respite. The snow didn't just fall. It built walls, sculpted drifts that had an architectural quality, as if shaped by some alien intelligence. The drifts followed patterns that seemed to defy simple physics. They formed curves and overhangs, created structures that looked almost deliberate in their design. Some drifts were hard-packed enough to walk on, while others would swallow you to the waist if you tried to cross them. The boundary between these different types of snow was often invisible, making every step a gamble. The landscape was transformed into something utterly unfamiliar, streets becoming canyons, familiar landmarks buried or disguised beyond recognition. People who lived through it spoke of the storm having a presence, a personality, even a purpose. This kind of language made some uncomfortable, suggesting superstition or irrationality. But those who had been there understood what was being expressed. It was not that they literally believed the storm was conscious, but that the experience of it had a quality that normal weather lacked. There was an intensity to it, a sense of being in the presence of something vast and indifferent and overwhelming that transformed it from a natural phenomenon into something that felt more like an encounter. This sense of the storm as something more than weather persisted in the folklore that grew up around it. Stories circulated and evolved, passed from person to person, each telling, adding new elements or emphasizing different aspects. The storm became a blank canvas onto which people projected their own fears and interpretations, a screen onto which the collective anxiety of the city was displayed. Ghost stories, inevitably, began to circulate. In a disaster of this magnitude, where death had come suddenly and often in isolation, it was perhaps natural that tales of hauntings would follow. People claimed to see figures in the snow on cold March nights, forms that moved against the wind, that left no footprints, that vanished when approached. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different accounts. The figures were usually seen from a distance, recognizable as human in shape, but with details that were always somehow unclear. They moved slowly, as if struggling against a resistance that observers could not see. When approached, they would fade away, not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming less distinct, till the observer could no longer be certain they had seen anything at all. Some said these were the spirits of those who had died in the blizzard, still wandering the streets they had tried to navigate in those final hours. This interpretation gave shape and meaning to what might otherwise have been dismissed as tricks of light and shadow. It suggested that the dead had left something of themselves behind, that their final desperate struggles had impressed themselves somehow onto the fabric of the city itself. The anniversary of the storm, March 12th, was particularly potent in these stories, a day when the barrier between past and present seemed thinner, when the echoes of that terrible event could be felt most strongly. In Central Park, where dozens had perished, night watchmen reported strange sounds, not the wind, which they knew well, but something else. These were men who spent their nights outdoors in all weather, who were familiar with the acoustic properties of the park and its many moods. They knew the difference between wind and falling branches, between animal calls and urban noise. What they reported hearing was none of these familiar sounds, voices perhaps, or something like voices calling out in distress, the sound of crunching footsteps in snow when there was no snow on the ground. The feeling of being watched from the darkness between the trees was another common experience. It was a sensation that was difficult to articulate, not a specific sight or sound, but a prickling awareness of attention from somewhere unseen. Rational men, not given to superstition, found themselves hurrying through certain areas of the park on their rounds, reluctant to linger, uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Some began to alter their routes to avoid these spaces, preferring longer paths to the unease that particular groves or clearings provoked. A lamplighter who worked the streets near Madison Square told his family about a woman he saw every March 12th on the anniversary of the storm. The consistency of the sighting was what made it particularly unsettling. Year after year, on the same date, at approximately the same time, she would be there. She stood at the same corner, wearing the fashion of the 1880s, looking up and down the street as if waiting for someone. Her clothes were never quite in focus. He could tell they were from an earlier era, but the specific details always eluded him when he tried to recall them later. He would call out to her, ask if she needed help, but she never responded, never acknowledged his presence. His voice seemed to pass right through her, as if she existed in a different layer of reality where his words could not reach. When he walked toward her, she would fade, not disappear suddenly, but gradually become less distinct, until he couldn't be sure if he was looking at a person or a shadow or simply a trick of the gaslight. Sometimes he would continue walking to the spot where she had stood, and there would be nothing there, not even a footprint or any disturbance of the pavement to suggest anyone had been present. These stories multiplied and evolved as such stories do. Each telling added new details, stripped away others, transformed the original events into something that served the needs of narrative rather than historical accuracy. The woman waiting at the corner acquired a backstory. She was waiting for her husband, some said, who had promised to come home but never arrived. Or she was waiting for a child, sent on an errand who never returned. Or she herself had frozen while waiting, and now was condemned to wait eternally, trapped in that final act of hope and anticipation. But beneath the embellishment there seemed to be a common thread, a sense that the blizzard had torn some kind of hole in the fabric of normal reality, and that through this hole strangeness had seeped in and never quite left. The storm had been an aberration, a moment when the normal rules seemed suspended, and in its wake the boundary between the possible and the impossible had become more permeable. This was not a belief that people stated explicitly, but it informed the way they talked about the storm and its lingering effects, a sense that something fundamental had shifted during those 3 days and had never entirely shifted back. The physical evidence of the storm was gradually erased. The snow melted, of course, first in the streets where the salt and the traffic broke it down, then more slowly in the parks and protected spaces where massive drifts could linger for weeks. The drifts collapsed, their architectural forms dissolving into slush and then water. The streets were cleared, an enormous effort that employed thousands of workers and hundreds of carts. Mountains of snow were hauled to the rivers and dumped, creating strange temporary islands of ice that slowly dissolved in the current. But the psychological impact endured. The blizzard had revealed something that the Gilded Age had tried hard to obscure, that for all the talk of progress and civilization and man's mastery over nature, humanity remained vulnerable in ways that no amount of technological advancement could fully address. This was an uncomfortable truth for a society that had invested heavily in the narrative of progress, in the idea that each generation would be more secure, more comfortable, more insulated from the harsh realities of the natural world than the one before. The storm had stripped away that comfortable illusion in the space of 3 days. It had shown that the city, for all its impressive infrastructure and technological sophistication, was still fundamentally vulnerable, that the systems people relied on, telegraph, trains, roads, heating, food distribution, could fail simultaneously and catastrophically, that when those systems failed, people were thrown back on much more primitive resources, on physical endurance and luck, and the kindness of strangers. The revelation was sobering, even traumatic, challenging fundamental assumptions about what modernity meant and what it could guarantee. The storm led to changes, of course. Disasters often do, forcing societies to address vulnerabilities they had previously ignored or underestimated. The decision to move utilities underground, for instance, had its origins in the sight of downed telegraph and electrical wires creating impassable tangles in the streets. The storm had demonstrated that overhead wires, whatever their convenience and low initial cost, were catastrophically vulnerable to ice and wind. The images of streets made impassable by fallen wires became powerful arguments for the expense and difficulty of burying utilities. The push for better weather forecasting received new urgency and funding. The Signal Service's failure to predict the storm's severity had been widely noted and criticized. In response, the government invested in more observation stations, better training for forecasters, and research into atmospheric science. The goal was to ensure that such a storm could never again arrive with so little warning. While perfect prediction remained elusive, and remains so to this day, the improvements were significant, gradually reducing the danger that weather posed to unprepared populations. Building codes were adjusted to account for extreme snow loads. Engineers studied the buildings that had collapsed or been severely damaged during the storm, looking for common factors and weaknesses. Standards were developed for roof strength, for the angle of roofs to allow snow to slide off, for the structural integrity needed to withstand not just the weight of snow, but the additional stress of high winds. These changes were implemented gradually as new construction followed the new codes and old buildings were slowly retrofitted or replaced. The elevated trains, which had proven so vulnerable to the storm, were eventually supplemented and then replaced by subway lines that ran beneath the earth where weather could not touch them. The images of elevated trains frozen in place, stranded high above streets that were themselves impassable, had made a powerful case for underground transit. The construction of the subway system was an enormous undertaking, years in the making and staggeringly expensive. But the blizzard had provided a stark demonstration of why it was necessary, why the city needed a transportation system that could function regardless of what was happening on the surface. In a strange way, modern New York, the New York of subways and underground utilities, of improved building standards and emergency preparedness, was partly born from the trauma of those 3 days in March. Every time you descend into a subway station, every time electricity flows reliably through underground cables, you are touching a legacy of the blizzard, feeling the echo of decisions made in response to that catastrophe. The infrastructure of the contemporary city carries within it the memory of that storm, even though most of the people who use it daily have no awareness of this connection. But there were other legacies, less tangible, but no less real. The blizzard entered the collective memory of the city in a way that few other events have. It became a measuring stick, a point of reference. For decades afterward, old-timers would compare every snowstorm to '88, and every snowstorm would be found wanting. "It's nothing like the blizzard," they would say, and in that comparison was a kind of pride. They had survived something that newer generations could scarcely imagine. This pride was complicated, mixed with other emotions that were harder to name. There was survivor's guilt, particularly for those who had lost friends or family members. There was the knowledge that their survival had often been a matter of luck, rather than any particular virtue or preparation on their part. There was the sense of having witnessed something that could not be adequately communicated to those who had not been there, a frustration at the gap between experience and description. But beneath all of this was a certain satisfaction in having endured, in having been tested by something genuinely terrible and having come through it. The stories were passed down, parent to child, becoming family lore. Your great-grandfather was trapped in his shop for 3 days during the Great Blizzard. Your great-grandmother was born during the storm, delivered by candlelight with no doctor because none could reach the house. These stories served a purpose beyond mere historical record. They connected people to the city's past, gave them a sense of lineage and survival, made them part of something larger than their individual lives. They were origin stories of a sort, explaining how families had come to be where they were, marking a before and after in family history. The details of these stories were often embellished with each retelling, growing more dramatic or more poignant as they passed from generation to generation. The shop where great-grandfather had been trapped became darker and colder with each version. The circumstances of great-grandmother's birth became more dire, the doctor's absence more tragic, the improvisation required more heroic. This embellishment was not dishonest exactly, but rather a natural process by which stories adapt to serve the needs of their tellers and listeners. The emotional truth of the stories, that people had suffered and endured something extraordinary, remained constant even as the specific details drifted. Artists found inspiration in the storm. Paintings were made, showing the city buried in white, with only the tops of buildings visible, like islands in a frozen sea. These works captured something essential about the experience, the sense of a familiar world transformed into something alien and hostile. The verticality of the city, usually a symbol of human ambition and achievement, became instead a measure of how deeply the snow had buried the human scale of life. Buildings that normally dominated the skyline were shown half swallowed by drifts, their pride humbled by the storm's power. Writers used it as a setting for stories, usually tales of survival and human endurance, though sometimes darker narratives about what people might do when civilization's thin veneer is stripped away by extreme conditions. The storm provided a natural crucible for exploring human nature under stress. Would people help each other or turn selfish and brutal? Would the bonds of society hold or dissolve? Would individuals rise to unexpected heroism or collapse into despair? The blizzard became a thought experiment made real, a test case for questions about civilization and savagery, altruism and selfishness that writers had been exploring for centuries. Some of these literary treatments were sensationalistic, focusing on violence and depravity, playing to popular appetites for melodrama. Others were more thoughtful, using the storm as a way to examine social class, gender roles, immigrant experiences, and other dimensions of urban life. The best of them captured something true about the experience, not the specific meteorological details, but the emotional and psychological reality of being trapped, cold, afraid, uncertain whether you would survive to see another day. Photographers, using the relatively new technology of the time, captured images that have become iconic. Men standing atop snowdrifts that reached second-story windows, looking small and isolated against the vast white landscape. These photographs had an immediate impact when they were published, making the scale of the disaster visible to people who had not experienced it directly. The images circulated widely, reproduced in newspapers and magazines, creating a visual record that complemented and sometimes contradicted the written accounts. Streets transformed into canyons of snow, the elevated train tracks festooned with icicles like some frozen cathedral. These images circulated widely, became postcards, were reproduced in magazines and newspapers across the country and eventually around the world. They gave the storm a kind of immortality, preserving specific moments and scenes that would otherwise have existed only in memory. Looking at these photographs today, more than a century later, we can see exactly what those men standing on the drift saw, can observe the precise way the snow sculpted itself around buildings and lampposts, can study the expressions on faces of people confronting something that overwhelmed them. The blizzard made New York famous in a new way. It had always been known as America's largest city, its financial capital, its gateway for immigration. These were the standard descriptors repeated in guidebooks and newspaper articles, emphasizing the city's importance and centrality to American life. But the storm gave it a different kind of notoriety, as a place where nature could still strike with devastating force, where the modern and the primitive existed in uncomfortable proximity. It humanized the city, in a sense, reminded people that beneath the hustle and ambition was something more vulnerable, more real. The juxtaposition was striking and memorable. Here was a city that represented the apex of 19th century urban development, with its skyscrapers and telegraph lines and elevated trains brought to its knees by snow and wind. The same forces that had threatened prehistoric humans could still threaten modern city dwellers. All the accumulated knowledge and technology of civilization could not prevent people from freezing to death just feet from their homes. This realization resonated beyond New York itself, became part of how Americans thought about cities and nature and the limits of progress. In the decades that followed, as the memory of the storm receded from lived experience into history, it underwent a subtle transformation. The generation that had experienced it firsthand began to age and die, taking with them the immediate visceral memory of what it had been like. Their children had heard the stories but had not felt the cold themselves, had not experienced the particular terror of being trapped while the wind screamed outside. With each generational remove, the storm became less real, more abstract, easier to mythologize. It became almost mythical, a sort of origin story for modern New York. The city that emerged after the blizzard was different from the one that existed before, more resilient, better prepared, more aware of its own fragility. This narrative was satisfying in its clarity and progression, in its suggestion that suffering had purpose and that hardship could be transformative. The storm became a kind of trial by ice, a test that the city had passed barely and been tempered by. Like all good myths, it simplified complex realities into a story that could be easily told and understood, that offered lessons and meaning. But for those who lived through it, who felt the cold bite deep, who knew the specific terror of being trapped while the wind screamed outside, it never became mythology. It remained viscerally real, a memory written into the body itself. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives, a wariness of March weather, a tendency to over-prepare for winter, a deep and lasting respect for the power of snow and wind. These were not abstract fears, but responses born from direct experience, from having been taught in the most fundamental way possible that the world could turn deadly without warning. Some of them, in their old age, would wake from dreams of being back in the storm, of struggling through streets that had no end, of searching for warmth that did not exist. The dreams would recur with surprising consistency, triggered sometimes by cold weather, sometimes by stress, sometimes by nothing discernible at all. The content varied, but the emotions were constant. the crushing sense of being overwhelmed, the desperation for shelter, the numbing cold that started in the extremities and worked its way inward toward the heart. The blizzard had marked them in ways that did not fade with time. They were survivors, but survival leaves its own scars. This is something that was understood imperfectly at the time, in an era before concepts like trauma and post-traumatic stress had entered common vocabulary. But people recognized that those who had been through the storm were changed by it, that they carried something with them that set them apart from those who had not shared the experience. There was a particular quality to their silence when talk turned to hardship or danger, a knowing that could not be faked or acquired second-hand. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of the Great Blizzard of 1888, not what happened, which is well documented, but what it meant to the people who experienced it. How did it change them? What did they see in those hours of white darkness that could not be captured in words or photographs? What understanding did they reach about their own fragility, their own mortality, the thin and precious nature of the warmth and safety they had taken for granted? These questions have no clear answers. They exist in the space between history and memory, in the gaps where personal experience cannot quite be translated into public record. Historical documents can tell us where people were, what they did, sometimes even what they said, but they cannot fully capture the internal experience, the shifts in consciousness and understanding that occur when someone confronts their own mortality in such a direct and unavoidable way. But they linger still, like the cold itself, like those ghostly figures some claim to see on March nights when the wind blows from the northeast and the air tastes of snow. The blizzard is over. It has been over for more than a century. The last person who experienced it as an adult is long dead, and even those who experienced it as children, who might have remembered the confinement, the fear in their parents' faces, the strange altered atmosphere of those days, have now passed away as well. No living memory of the storm remains. It exists now only in documents and photographs, in the infrastructure that was built in response to it, in the stories that have been passed down through generations until they have become almost abstract, disconnected from any immediate reality. But in some way, in the collective memory of the city, in the stories that are still told, in the infrastructure that was built in response to it, the storm continues. It is part of the city's DNA now, woven into its identity, a permanent feature of its historical landscape. The decisions made in the months and years after the blizzard shaped the physical form of the city in ways that endure to this day. Every underground cable, every subway tunnel, every building code requirement, these are the storm's legacy, the tangible evidence that the city learned from its brush with catastrophe. Yet there is something else that persisted, something harder to quantify but no less real. The blizzard established a kind of template for how New Yorkers think about crisis and endurance. It became a reference point for resilience, a reminder that the city had faced existential threats before and survived. In subsequent disasters, fires, floods, economic collapses, terrorist attacks, people would sometimes invoke the memory of the blizzard, consciously or not, as evidence that the city could withstand whatever was thrown at it. The specifics might be forgotten, the details lost to time, but the essential story remained. Once, the city was buried in snow and everyone thought it might not recover, but it did. This narrative was not always accurate or helpful. It sometimes led to a kind of complacency, a belief that simply enduring was enough, that survival itself was victory. It could obscure the very real suffering that had occurred, the lives lost and families destroyed, reducing complex human tragedy to a simple morality tale about resilience. It could make people less sympathetic to those who struggled to recover, less willing to acknowledge that not everyone bounced back with equal ease. But for all its limitations, the story of the blizzard and its aftermath provided New Yorkers with something they needed, a shared experience of adversity overcome, a founding myth of urban toughness. The anniversary of the storm was marked with varying degrees of attention over the years. In the early decades, when memories were still fresh and survivors still numerous, March 12th would bring newspaper retrospectives and gatherings of those who had lived through it. As time passed, the observances became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Historians would write books about the storm, documentaries would be made, museums would mount exhibitions. Each generation rediscovered the blizzard in its own way, finding in it whatever resonated with their contemporary concerns. During the Great Depression, the blizzard was remembered as an example of how people could endure hardship with dignity. During World War II, it became a story about the home front, about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage in the face of danger. In later decades, as concerns about climate change grew, the blizzard was sometimes invoked as evidence of extreme weather's capacity to disrupt modern life, a historical precedent for contemporary anxieties. The storm was endlessly reinterpreted, each era finding in it a mirror for its own preoccupations. The physical artifacts of the storm gradually made their way into museums and archives. Diaries and letters were donated by descendants who recognized their historical value. Photographs were collected and preserved, objects from that time, clothing people had worn, tools they had used to dig themselves out, pieces of furniture they had burned for warmth, were catalogued and displayed. These material remnants became relics of a sort, tangible connections to an event that had become almost legendary in its proportions. Walking through these exhibitions, visitors could see the actual pen that the Brooklyn woman had held when she wrote her final diary entry, could read her words in her own handwriting. They could view photographs of the man in the tree, the drifts towering over lampposts, the elevated trains suspended in their tunnels of ice. They could touch, in some cases, the very objects that people had clutched during those desperate hours. The museum experience attempted to bridge the gap between past and present, to make real something that otherwise existed only in history books. But there remained always a distance, an unbridgeable gap between witnessing evidence of an event and experiencing the event itself. No amount of preserved artifacts could fully convey what it had felt like to be cold in that particular way, to be frightened with that particular intensity, to confront mortality with that particular immediacy. The best the museums could do was gesture toward the experience, provide hints and suggestions, trust that imagination would fill in what preservation could not capture. In literature, the blizzard took on various symbolic meanings. For some writers, it represented nature's revenge on human hubris, the earth striking back at a civilization that had grown too confident in its mastery. For others, it was a test of character, revealing who people truly were when the social masks were stripped away. Still others saw it as fundamentally arbitrary, a random catastrophe that demonstrated the essential meaninglessness of the universe, how the innocent and guilty alike could be swept away by forces utterly indifferent to human concerns. The poets, in particular, were drawn to the storm's imagery. The white darkness, the howling wind, the transformed landscape, these provided rich material for metaphor and meditation. Some wrote elegies for the dead, attempting to honor those whose names had been lost but whose suffering demanded acknowledgement. Others explored the storm's aftermath, the slow process of recovery, and the way trauma persisted long after the physical danger had passed. The best of these poems captured something essential about the human response to catastrophe, the way it could illuminate or destroy, reveal or conceal. In the realm of personal memory, the blizzard lived on in unexpected ways. Families who had no direct connection to the storm sometimes incorporated it into their family histories anyway, claiming ancestors who had survived it even when the timeline didn't quite match up. This kind of historical appropriation spoke to the power of the story, its ability to confer a certain status. To have ancestors who had endured the Great Blizzard was to have roots that went deep, to be authentically New York in a way that newer arrivals could not claim. The psychology of this appropriation was complex. Part of it was simple prestige-seeking, the desire to connect oneself to an important historical event. But part of it reflected something deeper, a hunger for connection to the city's past, for stories that could provide context and meaning. In a place where so many people were from somewhere else, where the population turned over constantly and few families stayed in the same neighborhood for more than a generation or two, the blizzard provided a kind of anchor point, a shared experience that could create community across time. The storm also entered popular culture in more casual ways. References to it appeared in songs and stage productions, usually as shorthand for extreme weather or difficult times. The phrase "the Great Blizzard" became a kind of cultural touchstone, understood even by those who knew nothing of the actual historical event. It was invoked whenever snow fell heavily, used to add drama to weather forecasts, deployed as a comparison whenever winter conditions became challenging. This casual usage gradually eroded the specific historical meaning of the event, turning it into a generalized symbol rather than a particular occurrence. But perhaps this was inevitable. As living memory faded and the storm receded further into the past, it became less important as history and more important as myth. The specific details mattered less than the overall shape of the story, the narrative arc from catastrophe to recovery that could be applied to many situations beyond the original event. The children, who were born in the years immediately after the storm, grew up hearing about it constantly. Their parents and grandparents could not stop talking about it, could not help but use it as a reference point for everything that came after. Before the blizzard and after the blizzard became temporal markers that organized family and community history. These children absorbed the stories even when they grew tired of hearing them, and in turn passed them on to their own children, though often in simplified or altered form. As these stories traveled through generations, they underwent predictable transformations. Details that seemed trivial to later tellers were dropped. Events that happened to different people were sometimes merged into single narratives. Dates and locations became vague, but the emotional core of the stories remained intact: the fear, the endurance, the relief of survival. This emotional truth was what mattered most, what ensured the stories would continue to be told, even as their factual accuracy degraded. Some historians worried about this process, concerned that legend was overwhelming history, that the real event was being lost beneath layers of embellishment and myth-making. They worked to preserve primary sources, to establish definitive timelines, to separate fact from fiction. Their work was important, ensuring that anyone who wanted to know what actually happened could find reliable information. But they were fighting, in some ways, against the natural tendency of human memory, which cares less about accuracy than about meaning, less about what happened than about what it felt like. The neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by the storm developed their own particular relationships to its memory. In some areas, annual commemorations became tradition, with local historical societies organizing events and displays. In others, the storm was rarely mentioned, as if by common consent people had decided to move past it rather than dwell on it. These different approaches to memory sometimes reflected different ethnic or cultural attitudes toward trauma and resilience, different beliefs about whether suffering should be remembered or forgotten. The Jewish communities, many of them recent immigrants at the time of the storm, incorporated it into their broader narrative of survival and adaptation in America. The storm became another trial in a long history of trials, another test that had been passed. Italian neighborhoods told stories that emphasized community solidarity, the way neighbors had helped each other through the crisis. Irish communities focused on individual acts of heroism, particularly by policemen and firemen, many of whom were Irish. Each community shaped the memory to fit its own values and self-conception. In the African American community, which was often marginalized in official accounts of the disaster, oral histories preserved stories that might otherwise have been lost. These stories spoke of black workers who had kept essential services running, of black families who had taken in strangers regardless of race, of black communities that had suffered disproportionately but been largely ignored in the relief efforts. The storm had revealed, as disasters often do, the existing inequalities in society, and these inequalities shaped who survived and who did not, whose suffering was acknowledged and whose was overlooked. The storm's impact on transportation infrastructure, particularly the decision to build subways, had lasting implications for the city's development. The underground transit system allowed the city to expand in ways that would not have been possible with only surface transportation. Neighborhoods that had been remote and difficult to reach became accessible, leading to waves of development that pushed the city's boundaries outward. The population density of Manhattan could increase because people could now live in the outer boroughs and commute reliably into the center. This transformation was not without costs. The construction of the subway system required enormous expenditures of money and labor, involved dangerous working conditions that killed and injured many workers, displaced communities, and disrupted the city for years. But the alternative, continuing to rely on surface transportation that could be paralyzed by weather, seemed unacceptable after the blizzard. The storm had demonstrated that the city needed transportation infrastructure that could function regardless of surface conditions, and the subway provided that reliability. The underground utilities system similarly transformed the city's appearance and functionality. Streets that had been tangled with overhead wires became cleaner and more navigable. The visual clutter that had characterized late 19th century urban landscapes gradually disappeared. The city acquired a more streamlined, modern appearance. This aesthetic transformation was accompanied by practical improvements in reliability and safety. Underground cables were protected from weather, from accidental damage, from the various hazards that threatened overhead wires. Yet there was something lost in this process of modernization, a kind of visual honesty about the infrastructure that supported urban life. When wires were overhead, you could see the networks of communication and power that connected the city. When they went underground, they became invisible, creating an illusion that the city somehow functioned autonomously without the complex systems that actually made it work. This invisibility made people less aware of their dependence on infrastructure, less able to understand what it took to keep the city running. The building code changes that followed the storm were similarly double-edged. Stronger buildings were undoubtedly better, capable of withstanding heavy snow loads and high winds. But the new codes also increased construction costs, making housing less affordable for the working class. The tenements that were built after the blizzard were somewhat better than those built before, but they still concentrated poverty in ways that created other kinds of disasters. The storm had revealed the inadequacy of existing housing for poor people, but the response had not fully addressed this inadequacy. Weather forecasting improvements, meanwhile, became one of the clearer success stories to emerge from the blizzard. Investment in meteorology paid off in better predictions, earlier warnings, and lives saved. The science was still imperfect. Dramatic failures in forecasting would occur many times in the decades that followed, but the trajectory was clearly positive. Each decade brought better understanding of atmospheric dynamics, more sophisticated observational tools, more accurate predictions. By the mid-20th century, a storm like the 1888 blizzard could be predicted days in advance with reasonable accuracy. This improvement in forecasting created its own challenges. When people knew severe weather was coming, they sometimes became complacent, assuming they could prepare adequately and ride it out. The urgency that came with surprise was replaced by a more calculated response, which was generally beneficial but occasionally led to underestimation of danger. People who had time to prepare sometimes convinced themselves that preparation was sufficient, that they could handle whatever came. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they learn, too late, that knowing danger is coming is not the same as being able to prevent it. The blizzard also influenced urban planning in subtler ways, shaping discussions about density, about the concentration of population in vulnerable areas, about the wisdom of building higher and tighter. Some argued that the storm demonstrated the dangers of overconcentration, that spreading the population more widely across the landscape would reduce vulnerability. Others argued the opposite, that density actually improved survival because it meant help was closer at hand, resources could be shared more easily, isolation was less likely. These debates were never fully resolved, but they influenced the shape of urban development for decades. The storm's environmental impact, though rarely discussed in those terms at the time, was also significant. The massive amounts of wood burned for heat, the coal consumed to clear streets, the resources expended in recovery and rebuilding, all of this had ecological consequences that would not be fully understood for many years. The storm was a natural event, but the human response to it was not, and that response left its own mark on the landscape, depleting forests, polluting waterways, altering the physical environment in ways both visible and invisible. And on certain nights, when winter refuses to yield its grip and snow begins to fall in the gathering darkness, you might feel it, an echo, a whisper, a cold breath from the past reminding you that the world can still turn strange, that nature has not been fully tamed, that beneath the surface of modern life, older forces still move, patient and indifferent and utterly beyond human control. The city has changed immeasurably since 1888. It is larger, richer, more diverse, more technologically sophisticated, but it is not invulnerable. The illusion of control that modernity provides is just that, an illusion. The same forces that brought the Great Blizzard could, under the right conditions, bring something similar again. This awareness lives somewhere in the city's consciousness, rarely articulated but always present. When weather forecasters predict major snow, there is always a moment of unease, a flicker of ancestral memory, a recognition that winter storms are not entirely predictable or controllable. When the snow begins to fall heavily, when the wind picks up and visibility drops, something ancient stirs in the collective psyche. The city remembers in its bones, if not its conscious mind, what happened once and could happen again. The Great Blizzard of 1888 is history now, fixed in the past, subject to scholarly analysis and historical interpretation. But it is also more than history. It is a story the city tells itself about survival and vulnerability, about human resilience and natural power, about the thin line between civilization and chaos. It is a reminder that the world is not entirely knowable or controllable, that surprise and danger remain possible no matter how much we prepare. It is, in the end, one of the fundamental stories about what it means to live in this particular place, this city that was once brought to its knees by snow and wind and cold, and rose again, changed but enduring, marked forever by those 3 days in March, when everything stopped and the future hung in the balance, and the only certainty was the howling of the wind and the endless falling of the snow. Let us turn now to a different perspective, to the view from behind thick walls and frosted glass, where the storm pressed against the windows but did not quite penetrate. For while the tenement dwellers huddled around dying stoves and the working people froze in doorways and alleys, there existed another New York, insulated by wealth and privilege, experiencing the same blizzard through a very different lens. The brownstone mansions of Fifth Avenue stood like fortresses against the storm. These were buildings constructed with a solidity that spoke of permanence and confidence, their walls thick brick faced with stone, their windows double-hung and fitted with heavy velvet drapes that could shut out light and cold with equal efficiency. Inside these walls, gaslights burned steadily, fed by lines that ran beneath the streets where the storm could not reach them. Fireplaces in nearly every room consumed coal and wood that had been delivered in the days before the storm, stockpiled in basement storage rooms by servants who understood the rhythms of winter and prepared accordingly. In one such mansion, a family gathered in the parlor as the snow began to fall in earnest. The father, a banker whose name appeared regularly in the financial pages, stood by the window watching the street disappear beneath white. His wife sat near the fire, embroidery in her lap, though she had stopped working the needle and simply held it, gazing into the flames. Their children, 3 of them ranging from 16 to 8, played a desultory game of cards at a table by the far wall, their attention divided between the game and the increasingly dramatic weather outside. The servants moved quietly through the house, attending to their duties with the practiced efficiency of long service. The cook consulted with the housekeeper about provisions, making lists and checking the pantry, calculating how long they could sustain the household if the storm lasted days. The result was reassuring, weeks if necessary. The basement was well stocked with preserved goods, smoked meats, dried fruits, flour and sugar and coffee, all the staples of comfortable life. The coal bin was full, the wood pile was stacked high. Whatever was happening outside, the household could endure it without hardship. As evening fell on that first day, the family gathered for dinner in the formal dining room. Crystal glasses caught the gaslight. Silver gleamed against white linen. The meal, roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables from jars preserved the previous autumn, was perhaps simpler than usual, as the cook worked with what was immediately available rather than what might have been ordered fresh. But it was ample, satisfying, served with the usual ceremony that marked the difference between mere eating and proper dining. The conversation at the table turned, inevitably, to the storm. The father expressed concern about the city, about business that would be delayed, about meetings that would need to be rescheduled. The mother wondered about friends, about whether the Vanderbilts had made it back from their country estate, or were trapped there, about the charity committee meeting that had been scheduled for later in the week. The eldest daughter mentioned servants and workers, people who would be struggling, and her father nodded gravely and said something about the unfortunate timing, as if the storm had been scheduled poorly. But beneath the concern there was something else, a kind of muted excitement, the sense of experiencing something extraordinary from a position of safety. The storm was terrible, yes, but it was also magnificent, sublime in the old sense of the word, awful and beautiful simultaneously. From their protected vantage point, they could appreciate its grandeur without being destroyed by it. The younger children were simply thrilled. School was cancelled, the usual routines were suspended, the house had taken on the quality of an island, cut off from the world, and there was something delightful in that isolation. They pressed their faces to the windows, watching the snow accumulate, making bets about how high it would reach, imagining they could see shapes and figures moving through the white chaos. As the days passed and the storm continued, the household settled into an odd kind of holiday. The father attempted to maintain his normal schedule, rising early, reading the newspapers that could not be delivered, pacing his study in frustration at the enforced idleness. The mother organized the household, directed the servants, maintained the routines as much as possible, finding comfort in structure when the world outside had become structureless. The servants themselves occupied an interesting middle position. They were warm, fed, and safe, far better off than most of the city's working people during those days. But they were also trapped, unable to leave, to check on their own families, their own neighborhoods. The housemaid worried about her mother who lived alone in a tenement on the west side. The coachman fretted about his brother who worked at the docks, but they could not go, and so they continued their duties, polishing silver that would not be used, cleaning rooms that were already clean, finding tasks to fill the hours. In the grand hotels uptown, the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the St. Nicholas, the Hoffman House, similar scenes played out on a larger scale. Wealthy guests found themselves unexpectedly extended residence, their planned departures impossible, their rooms becoming temporary homes. The hotel staff worked tirelessly to maintain standards, to pretend that this was all somehow normal, that being snowbound was simply another form of luxurious leisure. The dining rooms stayed open, serving meals from stocks that had been meant to last weeks but were being depleted at an accelerated rate. The menus grew simpler as the days passed, but they remained menus, written in French, presented with ceremony. Oysters gave way to canned goods, fresh bread to day-old, but the pretense of normalcy was maintained. Guests dressed for dinner, jewelry was worn, wine was poured from the hotel's extensive cellars. The storm raged outside, but inside, civilization, or at least its performance, continued. In the smoking rooms and parlors, conversations took on a philosophical tone. Men who normally discussed stocks and property found themselves talking about nature, about progress, about humanity's relationship with the forces beyond its control. There was something almost medieval in these discussions, a return to older ways of thinking about the world. The 19th century had been so confident, so certain of man's ascending mastery over the natural world. The blizzard suggested otherwise. Some saw in it a kind of divine commentary, a reminder of limits and humility. Others viewed it as a challenge to be overcome, proof that infrastructure and preparation needed improvement. A few simply saw it as terrible bad luck, a statistical anomaly, the kind of extreme event that happens occasionally and means nothing larger. But even for those who maintained the most rational scientific perspective, there was something unsettling about the experience. The city they knew, the modern metropolis with its trains and telegraphs and bustling commerce, had been reduced to something more primitive in a matter of hours. All the systems they relied upon had failed simultaneously. And if those systems could fail against snow and wind, what did that say about their reliability in general? The wealthy, in their protected spaces, had time to contemplate these questions in ways that the poor did not. For the poor, the storm was immediate and physical, a matter of survival, of staying warm, of enduring. For the wealthy, it was also intellectual, emotional, almost aesthetic. They could afford to find meaning in it, to treat it as an experience to be processed and understood rather than simply survived. Yet there was awareness, even among the most insulated, of the wider suffering. Reports filtered in, rumors and second-hand accounts of deaths and disasters. The banker in his brownstone learned that his office building had lost part of its roof, that papers had been scattered across the street, that damage would be extensive. The hotel guests heard stories from staff members about family members in trouble, about neighborhoods buried, about people missing. Some responded with genuine concern, and later, when the storm passed, with genuine charity. Funds were established, donations made, relief efforts organized. The blizzard would produce a surge of philanthropic activity, the wealthy attempting to address the suffering that had been revealed so starkly. Whether this charity was sufficient, whether it addressed root causes or merely treated symptoms, would be debated then and ever after. Others responded with a kind of philosophical fatalism. The poor had always suffered. Winter was hard for them. This particular winter had been harder than most, but that was the nature of things. Society was stratified, some had more than others, and while this might be regrettable, it was also natural, inevitable, even divinely ordained, depending on one's theology. The storm had not created inequality, it had merely made visible what was always present. In the exclusive clubs that dotted the city, the Union Club, the Knickerbocker, the Manhattan, those members who had made it to the clubhouse before the storm hit found themselves in enforced camaraderie. These were spaces designed for comfort and exclusivity, with deep leather chairs, extensive libraries, excellent wine cellars, and staffs trained to anticipate every need. Trapped there, club members made the best of it, playing cards, smoking cigars, engaging in long, rambling conversations about everything and nothing. Some of these men had interesting perspectives. They had been young during the Civil War, had seen cities burned and armies frozen, had witnessed catastrophes that made even this storm seem manageable by comparison. They told stories of Andersonville and Cold Harbor, of Richmond after the surrender, of the long, hard years of Reconstruction. The blizzard was bad, they agreed, but they had seen worse. They had survived worse. The city would recover, as it always had. Others, younger men who had grown up in the relative peace and prosperity of the post-war years, found the storm more shocking. They had been raised to believe in progress, in the steady improvement of conditions, in humanity's increasing mastery over circumstances. The blizzard challenged that narrative, suggested that perhaps progress was more fragile than they had assumed. The club servants, like their counterparts in the private homes, maintained their professional demeanor while harboring private anxieties. They served drinks and meals, stoked fires, cleaned and tidied, all while wondering about their own families, their own neighborhoods, their own precarious positions in a city that could turn hostile so quickly. There was a particular poignancy in the contrast between the clubs and the streets just outside. Within the club walls, warmth, food, safety, fellowship. Beyond them, people dying of cold, families huddling in unheated rooms, workers frozen in their tracks. The club windows looked out onto a white wasteland where human shapes occasionally appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Members would stand at these windows, drinks in hand, watching the storm, and what they felt, guilt, pity, relief, fascination, was probably a complex mixture that they could not fully articulate even to themselves. As the storm finally began to weaken and the first recovery efforts started, the class divisions became even more apparent. The wealthy could afford to wait, to assess damage at their leisure, to hire help for repairs. The poor had to dig out immediately, had to find food and fuel, had to resume work as soon as possible because they could not afford days of lost wages. The streets revealed this divide starkly. On Fifth Avenue, servants cleared the sidewalks in front of brownstones, creating neat paths from doorway to street. In the tenement districts, people dug through drifts with their bare hands or with whatever implements they could find, desperate to create passage to markets, to workplaces, to any source of the necessities that meant the difference between continued survival and slow starvation. The elevated trains, when they finally started running again, carried people from the wealthy neighborhoods downtown to work, but many of the workers themselves had no way to reach the train stations. They trudged through snow that was still waist-deep in places, arriving at work exhausted, frostbitten, sometimes hours late, to face employers who docked their pay for the missed time. The relief efforts that were organized tended to be managed by the wealthy and directed toward the poor in ways that reinforced rather than challenged the existing hierarchy. Food and coal were distributed, yes, but often with conditions, with judgments about who deserved help and who did not. The deserving poor, those who could demonstrate employment, sobriety, proper conduct, received assistance. Others were left to manage as best they could. There were exceptions, of course. Some wealthy individuals responded with genuine empathy and generosity. Some made efforts to understand the conditions their less fortunate neighbors endured. Some allowed the storm to open their eyes to inequalities they had previously been able to ignore. But these were exceptions, noteworthy precisely because they were not the rule. The blizzard had revealed something uncomfortable, that the same city contained two completely different realities, two separate experiences of life. The wealthy New York of brownstones and private clubs existed alongside the poor New York of tenements and sweatshops, and usually these two worlds touched only tangentially in the formal interactions of employer and employee, customer and servant. The storm had forced a moment of recognition, had made the divide visible in ways it usually was not. But recognition does not necessarily lead to change. As the snow melted and the city returned to its normal rhythms, the old patterns reasserted themselves. The wealthy retreated behind their walls. The poor returned to their struggles. The storm became a story, a memory, eventually a piece of history, and the lessons it might have taught about shared vulnerability and common humanity were learned imperfectly, if at all. Still, something had shifted, even if only slightly. The blizzard had been a great equalizer in some ways. The wind had blown as hard on Fifth Avenue as on the Lower East Side. The snow had fallen on rich and poor alike. Death had taken a senator and anonymous immigrants with the same indifference. For a few days, everyone had been subject to the same forces, stripped of the usual protections that wealth and status provide. This shared experience, however brief, entered into the city's collective memory. It became a reference point, a story that could be told to illustrate various points about the unpredictability of nature, about the importance of preparation, about the resilience of the human spirit. And embedded in that story, often unstated but always present, was a reminder of inequality, of the different ways that people experience even the same disaster, of how suffering is distributed according to patterns that have more to do with economics than meteorology. The Great Blizzard of 1888 did not end inequality in New York, did not fundamentally transform the relationship between rich and poor. But it did create a moment of uncomfortable clarity, a brief window when the usual justifications and rationalizations fell away, and the raw reality of who suffered most and why became impossible to ignore. What people did with that clarity, how they processed it, and whether they allowed it to change them, varied enormously. But the clarity itself, however temporary, was real, and for some at least, it could not be entirely forgotten once the snow had melted and normal life resumed. And so we come to the end of our journey through those frozen days of March 1888, when time seemed to stop and the world turned white and still. The storm passed, as all storms must. The wind exhausted itself. The snow ceased falling. The clouds parted, and sunlight, pale winter sunlight, but sunlight nonetheless, returned to illuminate a transformed landscape. The city that emerged from beneath the snow was both familiar and strange. The buildings were the same, the street patterns unchanged, yet everything looked different. The snow had softened all the hard edges, covered the grime and soot, created a landscape of gentle curves and pristine whiteness that bore little resemblance to the industrial metropolis that lay beneath. For a few days before the thaw truly began, New York looked almost beautiful in a way it rarely did, peaceful, unified, simplified. But beneath that deceptive beauty lay the debris of catastrophe, bodies to be recovered, damage to be assessed, lives to be rebuilt. The work of recovery began slowly, hindered by the sheer volume of snow that had to be moved before normal activities could resume. Crews worked day and night, digging out streets, clearing train tracks, restoring the severed connections that had isolated the city from itself and from the wider world. The telegraph lines were repaired, and news began to flow again. The rest of the country learned what New York had endured. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia to Washington carried front-page stories about the Great Blizzard, with engravings and eventually photographs showing the extraordinary scenes. Streets vanished beneath drifts, trains buried to their roofs, people dwarfed by walls of snow. The storm became national news, then international, as reports reached London and Paris and beyond. New York's suffering had been witnessed, recorded, transmitted across continents. The personal recoveries took longer. The woman who had written in her diary, still waiting for morning, was buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn, her stone marking only her name and dates, the story of how she died lost to all but family. Roscoe Conkling was laid to rest with all the ceremony due a former senator, his funeral attended by dignitaries and covered extensively in the press, his death transforming him from a controversial figure into a tragic one. The thousands of others who had endured the storm returned to their lives carrying the experience with them in ways both obvious and subtle. Some bore physical scars, frostbite damage, respiratory problems from days in unheated rooms, injuries sustained in falls or collapses. Others carried psychological marks, a persistent anxiety about winter weather, a tendency to hoard supplies, dreams that returned them to those days of white captivity. But most of them simply continued because that is what people do. They returned to their jobs, their routines, their ongoing struggles with rent and food, and all the mundane difficulties of daily life. The storm had been extraordinary, but ordinariness reasserted itself with remarkable speed. Within weeks it had become something that had happened, part of the past, a story to be told rather than an immediate reality to be endured. The city itself learned from the disaster, though perhaps not as much or as quickly as it might have. The movement to bury utilities underground gained momentum, driven by the clear evidence of how vulnerable above-ground wires and pipes were to extreme weather. The subway system, which would eventually define New York, had its conceptual origins, at least partly, in the realization that transportation needed to be protected from the elements. Weather forecasting received new attention and investment. The failure to predict the blizzard's severity had been a professional embarrassment for the signal service, and reforms were implemented to improve both observation and prediction. The storm became a case study, its conditions analyzed and reanalyzed, its lessons incorporated into the developing science of meteorology. Building codes were strengthened with new requirements for roof strength and heating systems. Relief organizations developed protocols for responding to disasters, recognizing that ad hoc charity, while well-meaning, was insufficient for the scale of suffering that could result from events like the blizzard. The storm had revealed gaps in the urban infrastructure, and at least some of those gaps were addressed in the years that followed. Yet for all these practical legacies, perhaps the deepest impact of the Great Blizzard of 1888 was on the collective imagination, on the way people thought about their city and their place in it. The blizzard had demonstrated that civilization, for all its apparent solidity, was more fragile than most people had realized. The systems everyone relied upon, transportation, communication, commerce, could fail completely and suddenly, leaving people as vulnerable as their ancestors had been centuries earlier. This was a humbling realization, and different people responded to it in different ways. Some doubled down on faith in progress, seeing the blizzard as a challenge to be overcome through better technology and planning. Others became more cautious, more aware of limits, more respectful of nature's power. Most simply absorbed it into their worldview, adding it to the accumulated knowledge of what life could bring, another data point in their understanding of possibility. The storm passed into memory, then into history, then into legend. Each generation that lived through it told the story to the next, usually with some embellishment, some sharpening of detail, some heightening of drama. The children who had experienced it as a thrilling adventure grew old and told their grandchildren about the time New York disappeared beneath the snow. Those grandchildren, hearing the story in the comfortable safety of modern times, with reliable heating and weather forecasts and emergency services, found it almost impossible to fully imagine what their grandparents described. And now, more than a century later, we can visit that frozen city only through these stories, through photographs yellowed with age, through official reports, and personal letters preserved in archives. The experience itself is irrecoverable, separated from us by time and by the vast changes in how we live. We have technologies the people of 1888 could not have imagined. We have systems and safeguards and preparations that make a blizzard, while still dangerous, far less catastrophic than it was then. Yet something in the story still resonates. Perhaps it is the reminder of vulnerability, the knowledge that for all our preparations and technologies, nature retains the power to disrupt, to challenge, to humble. Or perhaps it is something simpler, the recognition of human endurance, the the way people faced extraordinary hardship, and most of them survived, continued, rebuilt. As you lie here now in your comfortable bed, in your heated room, with all the conveniences of modern life surrounding you, consider for a moment how different your experience is from those who huddled in cold tenement rooms during those March days of 1888. The warmth you feel, the safety you experience, the confidence that tomorrow will resemble today, these are not universal human experiences. They are specific to this time, this place, this moment in history. The people of 1888 did not have what you have. They lived harder lives, died younger, suffered deprivations that you will likely never know. And yet they endured. They found moments of joy and meaning in circumstances that would seem unbearable to you. They loved and hoped and worked and dreamed, just as you do, just as all humans have always done, regardless of the conditions they faced. There is something comforting in this continuity, in the recognition that human nature persists across all the changes in material conditions. The blizzard tested people of all types, the strong and weak, rich and poor, young and old, and revealed both the worst and best of human behavior. Some people were selfish, hoarding resources and looking only to their own survival. Others were generous, sharing what little they had, helping neighbors and strangers at risk to themselves. The storm itself was morally neutral, a confluence of atmospheric conditions operating according to physical laws that care nothing for human welfare. But how people responded to it, how they treated each other during and after, that was where meaning emerged, where the event became something more than mere meteorology. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the Great Blizzard of 1888, that disasters reveal character, both individual and collective. They strip away the normal social facades, the everyday pretenses, and show us who we really are. Sometimes what they reveal is admirable, sometimes less so, but it is always real, always true in a way that normal life, with all its cushions and compromises, is not. As the years passed and the people who had lived through the blizzard died, the event became increasingly abstract, a historical footnote, a curiosity. But for a time, for those who were there, it was absolutely real, absolutely immediate. It was the defining experience of their lives, the moment when everything changed, when they learned what they were capable of enduring, when they discovered reserves of strength or weakness they had not known they possessed. Let yourself imagine one last time what it was like. Not the dramatic moments, the storm at its height, the struggle through the streets, but the quiet hours, the waiting, the uncertainty, the cold that seeped into everything, the hunger that grew as food supplies dwindled, the way time stretched out, unstructured and seemingly endless. The particular quality of silence when all the usual city noises ceased. The strange beauty of the snow seen through a frosted window. The desperate hope that tomorrow would bring relief. And the sinking feeling when tomorrow came and brought only more snow, more wind, more cold. And then, finally, the end. The way the wind gradually died, the snow tapering off, then stopping, the clouds parting, the first rays of sunlight on white. The tentative emergence from shelter, blinking in the brightness, marveling at the transformed landscape. The relief so profound it was almost painful. The slow realization that you had survived, that it was over, that life would continue. That moment, the moment of emergence, of survival, of return, must have felt like a rebirth. The city had been tested and had endured. Its people had faced something terrible, and most of them had come through. They had learned things about themselves and each other that could not be unlearned. They had touched something primal and ancient, had been returned briefly to a more elemental mode of existence, and then had been released back into modernity, carrying that experience with them always. Let this story settle over you now like a gentle snow, soft and quiet, covering the sharp edges of the day. Let it slow your thoughts, ease your breathing, carry you into that drifting space between waking and sleep. The people of 1888 endured their long, cold night, and you have travelled with them through it, walked beside them in imagination, felt an echo of what they felt. But you are safe now, warm and comfortable, far removed from those frozen streets and desperate hours. Your night will be peaceful. Your sleep will be undisturbed by howling wind or biting cold. Tomorrow will come gently, bringing with it all the comforts and certainties of modern life. As you drift off, perhaps you will dream of snow, not the terrible storm of March 1888, but something softer, gentler, more beautiful. Snow falling quietly on a sleeping city. Snow that covers and softens and transforms. Snow that speaks of rest and peace and the deep quiet of winter night. The great blizzard of 1888 is over. It has been over for so long now that everyone who lived through it has passed beyond memory, beyond even the memory of memory. But the story remains, preserved in words and images, passed down through generations, still capable of teaching us something about endurance, about vulnerability, about the human capacity to survive and adapt and continue. Let it teach you now the simplest lesson of all, that you are here, in this moment, safe and warm. That whatever storms you face in weather or in life, they will pass. That morning always comes even after the longest, coldest night. That the human spirit, tested again and again throughout history, has always found a way to endure. Rest now. Let the story fade. Let your breathing slow. Let the warmth surround you. Let sleep come as gently as the first thaw after a long winter, melting away the day, easing you into dreams. The blizzard has passed. The city sleeps beneath its blanket of snow. And you, dear listener, can sleep too, knowing that you have journeyed far tonight, backward through time, to a frozen city and a vanished world, and have returned safely to your own warm bed, your own quiet night, your own peaceful rest. Sleep well, dream gently. And when morning comes, as it always does, you will wake to a new day, carrying with you perhaps some small memory of those who survived their own long night so many years ago in the great blizzard of 1888. Good night.